Hello. Tonight, you step into a world of silent, graceful ceremony, a society of fierce warriors trapped in an era of enforced peace, just moments before their entire reality is shattered forever. Before starting this video, which is only for you, relaxing and helping you sleep by clearing your mind, it would be a great support to us if you wrote where and when you watched it in the comments and subscribed. The social and political landscape of the Japanese archipelago in the middle of the 19th century was an edifice of profound and deliberate stasis, a carefully constructed and meticulously maintained system of social control that had been in place for more than 250 years, a period of almost unbroken and deeply unnatural internal peace. This long tranquility, which was known as the Great Peace, was the singular and all-consuming achievement of the Tokugawa shogunate, a military government that had, after a long and bloody century of civil war, succeeded in imposing a rigid and all-encompassing order upon every aspect of Japanese life. The very structure of the society was a formal and legally enforced hierarchy, a four-tiered pyramid of status that was believed to be a reflection of a natural and immutable cosmic order. At the apex of this pyramid was the samurai class, the hereditary warrior elite who, by right of birth and by the force of their two swords, constituted the ruling and administrative stratum of the nation. Below them were the farmers, the producers of the agricultural wealth upon which the entire system depended. Then came the artisans, the makers of goods. And at the very bottom of the social ladder were the merchants, a class that, while often possessing great material wealth, was held in a state of official and philosophical contempt for their perceived parasitism, their engagement in the vulgar and unproductive business of buying and selling the things that others had made. This entire complex structure was governed by a dense and intricate web of laws, customs, and ritual obligations, a system that was designed to ensure that every individual understood their precise place in the social order and that the potential for the kind of disruptive and ambitious social mobility that had characterized the preceding age of warfare was almost entirely extinguished. For the samurai class, this long peace had brought about a slow and profound transformation of their fundamental identity and their daily existence. They were still, in theory and in appearance, a warrior class, their distinct and privileged status visibly marked by their right to wear the daisho, the matched pair of long and short swords that were the very soul of their identity, but in the absence of any actual warfare, their primary function had slowly and inexorably shifted from that of the active combatant to that of the salaried bureaucrat and the leisured aristocrat. The vast majority of the samurai who were retainers of the shogun or of one of the more than 250 regional lords, or daimyo, lived not on their own landed estates, but were congregated in the castle towns of their lords, where they resided in segregated quarters and were supported not by the direct proceeds of their own land, but by a hereditary stipend, which was calculated and paid in a fixed quantity of rice, the primary currency and the ultimate measure of all value in this agrarian economy. Their lives were governed by a strict and monotonous routine, a daily round of largely ceremonial and administrative duties that often consisted of little more than the endless and meticulous copying of official documents, the practice of the traditional martial arts in a highly ritualized and non-lethal form, and the complex and time-consuming observance of the intricate etiquette of the feudal court. This life, while one of immense privilege relative to the other classes, was also one of a profound and often stultifying boredom, a state of perpetual and underemployed readiness for a war that never came, a condition that fostered a deep and obsessive preoccupation with the minutiae of honor, of status, and of the correct and proper performance of one's designated social role. The entire system was predicated on a principle of almost complete and deliberate isolation from the outside world, a national policy known as sakoku, which had, for more than 2 centuries, forbidden Japanese subjects from traveling abroad and had restricted all foreign trade and contact to a single, small and tightly controlled Dutch trading post on an artificial island in the harbor of Nagasaki. This self-imposed isolation had succeeded in preserving the unique and highly refined culture of Tokugawa Japan from the disruptive and often predatory influences of the encroaching Western colonial powers, but it had also created a society that was, in a technological and a military sense, a perfectly preserved and deeply vulnerable relic of a bygone age, a world that was entirely and catastrophically unprepared for the sudden and irresistible intrusion of the 19th century. The meticulously ordered and seemingly permanent world of the Tokugawa shogunate, which had for so long been insulated from the chaotic and rapidly changing currents of global history, was finally and irrevocably breached not by a gradual process of cultural osmosis, but by the sudden and deeply shocking appearance of a small but technologically overwhelming foreign naval squadron. In the summer of the year 1853, a fleet of 4 American warships, under the command of a commodore, steamed, uninvited and unopposed, into the strategic and symbolically important waters of Edo Bay, the maritime gateway to the shogun's capital city. The arrival of these vessels was an event that was profoundly and fundamentally alien to the entire conceptual and technological framework of the Japanese worldview, a deeply unsettling and almost supernatural intrusion that immediately and powerfully demonstrated the profound and almost unimaginable gap that had opened up between the isolated pre-industrial world of the shogunate and the dynamic, expansionist and technologically rapacious world of the industrializing West. The most terrifying and incomprehensible feature of these ships was their method of propulsion. 2 of the 4 vessels were steam frigates, massive paddle-wheeled behemoths that moved against the wind and the current with a relentless and seemingly magical power, their tall smokestacks belching out clouds of thick, black and foul-smelling smoke, a sight that led the Japanese observers to dub them the Black Ships. This ability to move with a speed and a purpose that was entirely independent of the natural forces of the wind and the tide was a direct and undeniable refutation of the natural order as it was understood by the Japanese, a demonstration of a power that seemed to be not of this world. The ships themselves were also of a size and a formidable warlike appearance that was far beyond anything in the shogunate's own antiquated and deliberately underdeveloped naval arsenal. They were painted a uniform and menacing black, their hulls bristling with the muzzles of a large number of heavy modern naval cannons, the mouths of which were left open in a deliberate and unambiguous display of latent military force. The technological superiority of these weapons was as profound and as unbridgeable as that of the steam engines that propelled them. The smoothbore, muzzle-loading cannon of the shogunate's coastal defenses were hopelessly outmatched and outranged by the modern, shell-firing Paixhan's guns of the American fleet, a new and devastating form of naval artillery that could fire explosive projectiles with a high degree of accuracy over a great distance. A technology that rendered the traditional stone and earthwork fortifications of the Japanese coastline almost entirely obsolete. The formal and stated purpose of the American expedition was a peaceful one: to deliver a letter from the President of the United States to the Emperor of Japan, a letter that requested the opening of the country to foreign trade and the establishment of diplomatic relations. The unspoken but universally understood message, however, was a threat. A clear and undeniable ultimatum that was backed by the overwhelming and unanswerable argument of a superior and deeply intimidating military technology. The response of the Tokugawa government to this unprecedented and deeply humiliating crisis was a mixture of confusion, paralysis, and a profound and deeply unsettling sense of existential dread. The established and highly ritualized protocols for dealing with foreigners, which had been developed over 2 centuries of carefully managed isolation, were utterly and completely inadequate to deal with this new and profoundly different kind of challenge, a challenge that could not be ignored, could not be repelled, and which seemed to offer no honorable or acceptable path of retreat. The appearance of the Black Ships in Edo Bay was, in a very real and tangible sense, the beginning of the end of the old Japan, the moment in which the carefully constructed and hermetically sealed bubble of the Tokugawa world was finally and irrevocably pierced, and through that small initial puncture, the full and irresistible force of the modern world would begin to pour in, a flood that would, in the space of a single generation, wash away the entire, seemingly timeless and immutable edifice of the feudal society. The profound and unprecedented crisis that had been initiated by the arrival of the foreign warships did not remain a simple external military problem, but was immediately and irrevocably transformed into a deep and corrosive internal political crisis, a development that was triggered by a single catastrophic and almost unthinkable decision made by the highest levels of the shogunal government, or bakufu. Faced with an ultimatum for which it had no military answer and no diplomatic precedent, and paralyzed by a profound and debilitating indecision, the shogunal council in the great castle at Edo took a step that was entirely without parallel in the 2.5 centuries of Tokugawa rule. It formally solicited the opinions of all of the daimyo, the great regional lords of the realm, including those who were traditionally excluded from any role in the formulation of national policy. This act, which was intended to create a sense of national unity and to diffuse the responsibility for what was certain to be a deeply unpopular and humiliating decision, had the precise and opposite effect. It was a stunning and public admission of the bakufu's own weakness and its inability to perform the most fundamental duty of a government, which was to manage the foreign relations of the state and to provide for the national defense. For more than 2 centuries, the shogunate had ruled by absolute and unquestioned authority, its decisions handed down as immutable edicts from the central government, and the daimyo, while possessed of a significant degree of autonomy within their own domains, had been systematically and deliberately excluded from any participation in the affairs of the nation as a whole. By now asking for their advice, the shogunate was inadvertently and disastrously empowering them, giving them a legitimate voice in a national debate for the first time and, in the process, inviting a torrent of criticism, dissent, and factional intrigue that would ultimately and inexorably lead to its own destruction. The responses that flooded back to Edo from the great castle towns across the country revealed a nation that was profoundly and irreconcilably divided, a political landscape that was fractured into 2 broad and mutually hostile camps. The first of these, and initially the most vocal and numerous, was the party of the hardliners, the advocates of a policy known as Joy, which meant, expel the barbarian. This faction, which was composed primarily of the more conservative and traditionalist daimyo, and which was animated by a deep and long-standing xenophobia and a profound and almost mystical belief in the spiritual and martial superiority of the Japanese nation, argued for a policy of immediate and uncompromising military resistance. Their arguments were based not on a rational or a realistic assessment of the military and technological balance of power, of which they were almost entirely ignorant, but on a deeply emotional and ideological commitment to the preservation of the national honor and the sacred purity of the Japanese soil. To treat with the foreigners, in their view, was an act of profound and unforgivable cowardice, a betrayal of the warrior's code and a stain upon the legacy of their ancestors. They argued that any concession, no matter how small, would be interpreted by the barbarians as a sign of weakness and would only lead to further and more intrusive demands, and that the only honorable course of action was to mobilize the entire samurai class and to drive the foreign invaders back into the sea, a victory that they believed was assured by the superior fighting spirit and the divine protection that the nation enjoyed. The second and opposing faction, which was smaller but which included some of the more pragmatic and worldly wise of the great lords, advocated for a policy of kaikoku or open the country. Their position was based not on any particular affection for the foreigners or any desire to abandon the traditional ways of the nation, but on a cold, hard, and deeply unpleasant assessment of the technological and military realities of the situation. A small but significant amount of information about the outside world, and particularly about the recent and disastrous encounter between the Great Qing Empire in China and the industrial and military might of Great Britain in the Opium Wars, had trickled into Japan through the narrow and tightly controlled channel of the Dutch trading post at Nagasaki, and those who had access to this information understood, with a chilling and undeniable clarity, the utter futility of any attempt at direct military resistance. They saw that a war with the Western powers, which would be fought with modern shell-firing cannon against the antiquated, matchlock muskets and the ceremonial swords of the samurai, would not be a glorious and heroic struggle, but would be a suicidal and unwinnable act of national self-destruction. They argued, therefore, for a policy of strategic and temporary appeasement, a reluctant and carefully managed opening of the country to the foreigners' demands, a move that was intended not as a surrender, but as a tactical maneuver designed to buy the precious and desperately needed time that would be required for Japan to study, to copy, and to eventually master the new technologies of the West, a process that would, in the long run, allow the nation to meet the barbarians on their own terms, and to eventually achieve the same ultimate goal as the Joy faction, the preservation of the nation's sovereignty and its ultimate independence. The shogunate, caught between these two irreconcilable positions and now stripped of its own unquestioned authority to act, was plunged into a state of almost total political paralysis, its endless and inconclusive internal debates a fatal and public display of the indecision and the weakness that would soon prove to be its final undoing. The immediate crisis presented by the foreign ultimatum was temporarily resolved not by the achievement of a national consensus, which had proven to be an impossibility, but by the reluctant and deeply humiliating decision of the shogunal government to yield to the non-negotiable demands of the American Commodore, an act of pragmatic capitulation that was intended to avert the immediate and catastrophic prospect of a naval bombardment of Edo. In the spring of the year 1854, after a period of tense and difficult negotiations, the representatives of the Tokugawa shogunate and the United States signed the Convention of Kanagawa, the first formal treaty between the two nations and the legal and symbolic instrument that brought Japan's 2.5 centuries of self-imposed isolation to a formal and definitive end. The treaty, while falling far short of the comprehensive commercial agreement that the Americans had initially hoped for, was nonetheless a document of profound and far-reaching significance, a thin and seemingly innocuous wedge that would, in the years to come, be used to pry open the country to the full and irresistible force of Western economic and political influence. The specific articles of the treaty were, on the surface, relatively modest and limited in their scope, a reflection of the shogunate's desperate attempt to concede the absolute minimum that was necessary to satisfy the foreigners and to make their menacing black ships go away. The treaty stipulated the opening of two remote and relatively unimportant ports, Shimoda and Hakodate, to American ships, not for the purposes of general trade, but solely for the acquisition of essential supplies such as water, food, and coal. It also guaranteed the humane treatment of any shipwrecked American sailors who might wash ashore on the Japanese coast, and it included a provision for the establishment of an American consulate in the port of Shimoda, a clause that, while seemingly a minor diplomatic formality, would prove to be a critical and deeply transformative one, as it established a permanent and official foreign presence on Japanese soil for the first time in more than 200 years. The most significant and, for the future of Japan, the most fateful of all the treaty's provisions, however, was a seemingly innocuous and standard diplomatic article known as the Most Favored Nation Clause. This clause, which was a standard and non-negotiable feature of almost all of the treaties that the Western powers imposed upon non-Western nations in the 19th century, stipulated that any rights or privileges that the shogunate might, in the future, grant to any other foreign nation would be automatically and immediately extended to the United States as well. This seemingly benign and reciprocal-sounding provision was, in reality, a powerful and one-sided diplomatic ratchet, a mechanism that ensured that the process of opening the country would be a continuous and irreversible one, as every small concession that was extracted by one foreign power would immediately become the new and universal baseline for all of the others. The signing of this treaty, which was soon followed by the signing of a series of similar and often more demanding treaties with Great Britain, Russia, and the other major European powers, who were quick to capitalize on the precedent that had been set by the Americans, was an act of profound and almost unbearable national humiliation for a significant and powerful segment of the samurai class. The Bakufu's decision to sign the treaty, while arguably the only rational and realistic course of action available to it, was portrayed by its growing number of internal enemies as an act of treasonous and unforgivable weakness, a betrayal of the sacred duty to protect the nation from foreign contamination. The treaty, which had been intended by the shogunate to be a solution to the foreign crisis, was instead transformed into the primary and most potent symbol of the government's failure and its loss of legitimacy, and it became the central and most powerful rallying cry for a new and increasingly radical political movement that was now beginning to coalesce, a movement that was united by a new and dangerously revolutionary slogan: Sano Joy, revere the emperor, expel the barbarian. This slogan, which cleverly and powerfully linked the popular and deeply emotional cause of xenophobic anti-foreignism to the older and more profound question of the ultimate source of political legitimacy in the Japanese state, would become the ideological and emotional engine of the violent and transformative revolution that was now, slowly and inexorably, beginning to unfold. The emergence of the Sano-Joi movement as a coherent and increasingly radical political force represented a fundamental and deeply destabilizing challenge to the entire ideological and political framework of the Tokugawa shogunate, a challenge that was directed not only at the shogunate's specific and deeply unpopular policies regarding the foreign powers, but at the very legitimacy of its existence as the de facto ruling authority of the Japanese state. For more than 2.5 centuries, the shogunate had maintained its power through a complex and carefully balanced political arrangement in which the shogun, who was the supreme military commander and the head of the Tokugawa clan, governed the country in the name of the emperor, who resided in a state of splendid and almost total political impotence in his secluded and highly ritualized court in the ancient capital city of Kyoto. The emperor, who was believed to be a direct descendant of the sun goddess Amaterasu and the living embodiment of the divine and unbroken imperial line, was the ultimate and sole source of all legitimate political authority in the nation, but his power was an almost entirely symbolic and religious one, a sacred, charismatic authority that was kept carefully insulated from the messy and profane business of actual day-to-day governance. The shogun, by contrast, was the holder of the real, effective, and coercive power, the master of the great military and bureaucratic machine that administered the country, but his authority was, in a theoretical and a constitutional sense, a delegated one, a power that he exercised as a kind of permanent and hereditary regent on behalf of the reigning, but not ruling, emperor. This delicate and highly functional division of labor, between the sacred but powerless authority of the imperial court in Kyoto and the profane but all-powerful administrative authority of the shogunal government in Edo, had been the stable and unquestioned foundation of the Tokugawa political order for more than 250 years. The Sano-Joi movement, however, deliberately and brilliantly attacked the very heart of this system by arguing that the shogun, through his treasonous and cowardly act of signing the unequal treaties with the foreign barbarians, had not only failed in his sacred duty to protect the nation but had, in the process, usurped the legitimate and sovereign authority of the emperor, who, the movement's ideologues claimed, had never given his divine consent to these humiliating agreements. By framing the political struggle in these terms, the leaders of the movement, who were primarily a group of young, idealistic and often low-ranking samurai from some of the great, outside domains of Western Japan, which had long harbored a deep and simmering resentment of Tokugawa rule, were able to transform what had begun as a simple policy dispute into a profound and deeply resonant national and religious crusade. The call to revere the emperor was not merely a statement of traditional and orthodox political sentiment, but was now a radical and revolutionary demand for the restoration of direct imperial rule, a call for the overthrow of the shogunate and for the return of the emperor to his rightful and ancient position as the true and effective ruler of the Japanese nation. This powerful and emotionally compelling ideology provided a single unifying banner under which a wide and disparate collection of anti-shogunal forces could now begin to coalesce. The great and powerful daimyo of the Western domains, who saw in the crisis an unprecedented opportunity to finally overthrow the hated Tokugawa hegemony and to reassert their own power on the national stage. The large and growing class of impoverished and discontented lower-ranking samurai, who were frustrated by the rigid and stultifying hierarchy of the Tokugawa system and who were drawn to the new movement's promise of a more meritocratic and meaningful existence. And even a small but influential group of court nobles in Kyoto, who had for centuries been excluded from any real political power and who now saw a chance to restore the prestige and the influence of the imperial institution. The second half of the slogan, "Expel the Barbarian," provided the emotional and xenophobic fuel for this new and explosive political mixture, a powerful and easily understood rallying cry that was capable of mobilizing a broad and popular sentiment of anger and humiliation and of directing it against the clear and tangible target of the shogunal government, which was now portrayed as the weak and corrupt agent of the foreign contamination. This potent and highly volatile combination of imperial loyalism and violent xenophobia plunged the country into a new and deeply unstable period of political violence and intrigue, a decade of almost constant low-level civil war that was known as the Bakumatsu, or the end of the Bakufu. This was a period that was characterized not by the large-scale, pitched battles of the earlier age of warfare, but by a more shadowy and insidious form of conflict, a campaign of targeted political assassinations, of urban terrorism, and of small-scale, localized military clashes between the forces of the shogunate and the growing armies of the rebellious western domains, a slow and inexorable erosion of the central government's authority that would ultimately lead to its complete and final collapse. The long and tumultuous decade of the Bakumatsu, which was characterized by an escalating and seemingly endless cycle of political assassination, of localized military conflict, and of increasingly desperate and ultimately futile attempts at reform by the beleaguered shogunal government, finally culminated in a swift and remarkably bloodless political revolution that would, in the space of a few short months, bring more than 2.5 centuries of Tokugawa rule to a definitive and unceremonious end. The final catalyst for this collapse was not a single decisive military defeat, but was a slow and inexorable process of political and military attrition that had, by the end of the year 1867, left the shogunate almost entirely isolated, financially bankrupt, and stripped of any remaining shreds of its political legitimacy. The great and powerful domains of the West, most notably the domains of Satsuma and Chashu, which had for years been the two most powerful and implacable centers of anti-shogunal resistance, had, after a long period of mutual suspicion and rivalry, finally forged a secret but powerful military alliance, a coalition that was dedicated to the single, clear, and uncompromising goal of overthrowing the Tokugawa regime by force and of establishing a new centralized government under the direct and personal rule of the young emperor. These Western domains had, for the preceding decade, been engaged in a clandestine but highly effective program of military modernization, using their significant commercial wealth to purchase modern, Western-style rifles and artillery from the very foreign merchants whose presence in the country they so loudly and publicly condemned, and they had secretly built a new and formidable military force, an army that was not only better equipped but was also better trained and more highly motivated than the increasingly demoralized and anachronistic forces of the shogunate. Faced with the undeniable reality of this new and overwhelming military and political coalition, and recognizing the utter futility of attempting to suppress it through a full-scale and almost certainly unwinnable civil war, the 15th and final Tokugawa shogun, a young and relatively progressive and reform-minded man, made the pragmatic and historically momentous decision to voluntarily relinquish his political authority and to return the reins of government to the imperial court. In a formal and highly symbolic ceremony that was held in the Great Nijo Castle in Kyoto in the 11th month of the year 1867, the shogun formally and publicly tendered his resignation, an act that was known as Teisei Hoken, or the restoration of political power. This act, which was intended by the shogun to be a strategic and preemptive maneuver, a way to avoid a catastrophic civil war and to preserve a significant, though now less formal, role for the Tokugawa clan in the new, national government that was to be formed, was immediately and ruthlessly outmaneuvered by the more radical and uncompromising leaders of the Satsuma and Chashu alliance. In the first month of the following year, the leaders of the Western domains, acting in the name of the 15-year-old emperor, staged a swift and decisive palace coup in Kyoto, seizing control of the imperial court and issuing a formal imperial edict that announced the definitive and absolute restoration of direct imperial rule, an event that would come to be known as the Meiji Restoration. This edict not only accepted the shogun's resignation but went much further, formally abolishing the office of the shogun in its entirety, stripping the Tokugawa clan of all of its lands and its titles, and declaring the shogunate to be and to have always been an illegal and usurpatory form of government. This was a radical and revolutionary declaration, a complete and total repudiation of the entire political and social order of the preceding 250 years. While this move did not, in the end, manage to entirely avert the outbreak of a final, brief and one-sided civil war, a conflict known as the Boshin War, in which the last, die-hard remnants of the shogunate supporters were swiftly and decisively crushed by the modernized and overwhelmingly superior armies of the new imperial government, the political and ideological victory was already complete. The long and seemingly timeless era of the samurai, an age that had been defined by the absolute and unquestioned rule of a military government, had, in the space of a few short weeks, been brought to a sudden, stunning, and almost unimaginably abrupt end, and the nation was now poised on the brink of a new and profoundly uncertain age, an era that would be defined not by the slow and graceful rhythms of the feudal past, but by the relentless and unforgiving logic of the modern, industrial world. The new and ostensibly traditionalist government that had been established in the name of the restored emperor was, in reality, a profoundly radical and revolutionary regime, a small and tightly knit oligarchy of young, pragmatic, and exceptionally capable samurai from the victorious Western domains who, despite the anti-foreign rhetoric that had brought them to power, were now fully and unshakably convinced that the long-term survival of the Japanese nation was entirely and exclusively dependent on a program of rapid, systematic, and all-encompassing modernization, a process of state-directed transformation that would be modeled directly on the political, the economic, and the military systems of the very Western powers that they had so recently and so loudly sworn to expel. The central and overriding objective of this new Meiji government was the creation of a strong, centralized, and internationally respected nation-state, a Fukoku Kyohei or rich country strong army, that would be capable of not only resisting the existential threat of Western colonialism but of eventually meeting and even surpassing the great industrial powers of Europe and America on their own terms. To achieve this ambitious and almost unimaginably difficult goal, the new leaders recognized that it would be necessary to completely and ruthlessly dismantle the entire decentralized and profoundly inefficient political and social structure of the old feudal system and to replace it with a new, more rational and more powerful set of national institutions. The first and most critical step in this process of national unification was the formal and definitive abolition of the feudal domains themselves, the more than 250 semi-autonomous territories that had for centuries been the private and hereditary possessions of the daimyo and which had been the primary and most significant barrier to the creation of a truly unified and centrally governed state. In a brilliant and largely bloodless political maneuver, the government, in the year 1871, issued an imperial edict that formally and summarily abolished all of the old domains and replaced them with a new and uniform system of centrally administered prefectures, the boundaries of which were deliberately drawn to cut across the old feudal loyalties. The daimyo, who were the hereditary rulers of these domains, were stripped of their lands and of their political and military authority and were effectively pensioned off by the central government, their long and proud history as the semi-independent princes of the realm brought to an abrupt and unceremonious end. This radical and fundamental restructuring of the nation's political geography was accompanied by an equally profound and far-reaching series of social and economic reforms that were designed to break down the rigid, hereditary, and economically inefficient class structure of the old Tokugawa society and to replace it with a more fluid, more meritocratic, and more productive modern social order. The old, four-tiered hierarchy of samurai, farmer, artisan, and merchant was formally and legally abolished, and all of the emperor's subjects were declared to be, in a theoretical and a legal sense, commoners or heimin, with the same rights and the same obligations before the law. A new and universal system of taxation was introduced, a system that was based not on the old, cumbersome, and inflexible payment of a fixed quantity of rice, but on a modern and more efficient tax that was assessed as a percentage of the monetary value of the land. A reform that provided the new central government with a predictable and inflation-proof source of the cash revenue that it so desperately needed to fund its ambitious program of industrial and military modernization. The government also embarked on a massive and state-sponsored program of industrialization, investing heavily in the creation of a modern infrastructure of railways, telegraph lines, and postal services, and it established a series of model factories, in fields such as textiles, cement, and armaments, which were designed to introduce and to disseminate the new technologies of the West. A new universal system of compulsory primary education was established, a system that was designed to create a literate, numerate, and ideologically loyal citizenry, and thousands of Japanese students were sent abroad to the universities and the technical schools of Europe and the United States to study the sciences, the engineering, and the political systems of the West, while a large and equally influential army of foreign experts and advisors, the Oyatoi Gaikokujin, were hired at great expense to come to Japan and to assist in the creation of the new modern institutions of the Meiji state. This entire, dizzying, and almost unimaginably rapid process of top-down, state-directed modernization was a revolution that was as profound and as far-reaching as any in modern history, a complete and almost total remaking of a nation's political, social, and economic life that was carried out in the space of a single generation. For the samurai class, the hereditary warrior elite who had for centuries been the undisputed masters of the old feudal world, the dizzying and relentless pace of the Meiji reforms was not a story of progress and national rebirth, but was a slow, painful, and inexorable process of collective and personal annihilation, a systematic and officially sanctioned dismantling of their entire world and of their most fundamental and deeply held sense of identity. The new Meiji government, which was itself led by men of samurai origin, recognized that the continued existence of a large, privileged, and economically unproductive hereditary warrior class was a profound and unsustainable anachronism in the new, modern, and meritocratic nation that they were seeking to build, and they proceeded, with a cold and unsentimental logic, to strip the samurai of the very legal and economic privileges that had for so long defined their unique and elevated status. The first and in many ways the most symbolically devastating of these blows came with the promulgation of the Heitoriai Edict in the year 1876, a law that formally and universally prohibited the wearing of swords in public by all but the members of the new modern national army and the police. This was not a minor or a cosmetic change, but was an act of profound and almost unimaginable cultural violence, as the two swords of the samurai were not mere weapons or accessories, but were the most sacred and the most visible embodiment of their class identity, the very soul of their honor and their hereditary right to rule. The image of the disarmed samurai, now legally indistinguishable in his public appearance from a common merchant or a farmer, was a powerful and deeply humiliating symbol of the complete and irreversible inversion of the old social order. This symbolic death was accompanied by a more tangible and in many ways more devastating economic one. The traditional hereditary stipends of the samurai, which had for centuries been paid in a fixed quantity of rice and which had been the economic foundation of their leisured and largely non-productive lifestyle, had become an immense and unsustainable financial burden on the new central government. In a series of gradual but inexorable steps, the government first converted these rice stipends into a less valuable and more easily managed cash payment, and then in the year 1876, it summarily and unilaterally abolished them altogether, replacing them with a one-time, lump-sum payment of interest-bearing government bonds, the value of which was often a small and wholly inadequate fraction of the capitalized value of the original stipend. This act, which was known as the Chitsuroku Shobun, was, in essence, a state-sponsored and legally enforced act of mass bankruptcy, an expropriation of the samurai's last remaining economic asset that plunged the vast majority of the class, particularly the lower-ranking members who had no other source of income, into a state of immediate and often desperate poverty. Stripped of their swords, their stipends, and their traditional social function, the samurai were now set adrift in a new and unfamiliar world, a competitive, capitalist society in which their old feudal skills of swordsmanship and the recitation of the Chinese classics were now almost entirely useless, and in which they were forced for the first time in their lives to compete for a living on an equal footing with the very commoners whom they had for so long been taught to despise. The result was a profound and widespread crisis of identity, a deep and often agonizing sense of loss, of uselessness, and of a profound and unutterable betrayal, as the men who had once been the proud and undisputed masters of the nation were now reduced to the status of impoverished and anachronistic relics of a bygone age. The response of the samurai class to this systematic and officially sanctioned process of social and economic annihilation was not one of passive or universal acceptance, but was a complex, varied, and ultimately tragic mixture of reluctant adaptation, of desperate and often ill-fated entrepreneurial activity, and, for a significant and deeply disaffected minority, of violent and reactionary resistance. For the vast majority of the former samurai, who now found themselves stripped of their traditional sources of income and their privileged social status, the only viable path forward was to attempt, with varying degrees of success and enthusiasm, to adapt to the new and unforgiving realities of the Meiji economic and social order. Many of the higher-ranking and better-educated members of the old samurai elite, particularly those who had been associated with the victorious Western domains that had led the restoration, were able to successfully navigate this difficult transition by leveraging their education, their administrative experience, and their political connections to secure positions in the new and rapidly expanding government bureaucracy, in the officer corps of the new National Army, or in the managerial ranks of the new state-sponsored industrial enterprises. These men, who had the cultural capital and the political foresight to recognize the irreversible nature of the changes that were taking place, effectively transformed themselves from a feudal, warrior aristocracy into a new, modern, and highly influential bureaucratic and technocratic elite, and they would go on to play a central and often dominant role in the political and the economic life of the new Meiji state for many decades to come. For the vast and impoverished majority of the lower-ranking samurai, however, who lacked these advantages of education and high-level political connections, the path of adaptation was a far more difficult and often deeply humiliating one. These men were forced to seek a living in a wide and often desperate variety of new and unfamiliar occupations, becoming school teachers, local government clerks, policemen, or, in a particularly common and poignant trajectory, small-scale merchants and shopkeepers, a profession that was, in the rigid and hierarchical worldview of the old samurai ethos, the most despised and the most dishonorable of all possible occupations. The attempt by these former warriors to navigate the unfamiliar and often treacherous waters of the new competitive market economy was a frequent and often tragicomic subject of the popular literature and the woodblock prints of the period, which often depicted the hapless and clumsy samurai, Bukyo na samurai, struggling and failing to make a living in a world whose commercial and profit-driven logic was entirely alien to their traditional anti-materialistic and honor-based value system. For a smaller but significant and highly vocal segment of the dispossessed samurai class, however, the path of quiet and reluctant adaptation was an unacceptable and deeply dishonorable one, and their response to the radical and seemingly endless series of reforms that were being handed down by the new government in Tokyo was one of growing anger, of deepening alienation, and of an increasingly violent and reactionary opposition. This resistance was not a single, unified, and ideologically coherent movement, but was a series of localized, sporadic, and ultimately uncoordinated and unsuccessful armed uprisings, or Shizuoka Hanran, that erupted across the country, particularly in the old, conservative domains of the Southwest, in the years following the abolition of the samurai's most cherished privileges. These rebellions were, in essence, the last desperate and ultimately suicidal death throes of the old feudal order, a series of profoundly backward-looking and reactionary movements that were animated not by a coherent and forward-looking political program, but by a deeply emotional and almost mystical attachment to the lost world of the past and by a profound and almost pathological hatred of the new, foreign-influenced and seemingly soulless world that was being created by the evil and corrupt counselors who, they believed, had captured and misled the young emperor. The rebels fought not for the creation of a new and different kind of modern state, but for the restoration of the old, familiar, and idealized world of the Tokugawa past, for the reinstatement of their hereditary stipends, for the re-establishment of the daimyo as the rulers of their ancestral domains, and, most importantly and most symbolically, for the restoration of their exclusive right to wear the two swords that were the very soul and the ultimate justification of their existence. These samurai rebellions, while often fought with an almost superhuman bravery and a reckless disregard for death that was entirely in keeping with the highest ideals of the warrior's code, were, from a purely military perspective, doomed and hopeless affairs from their very inception. The rebels, who were typically armed with their traditional swords and spears, and who were often supplemented by a small number of antiquated, muzzle-loading muskets, were fighting not against the equally anachronistic armies of a rival daimyo, but against the new and formidable military machine of the modern, centralized Meiji state. The final and most definitive of these samurai rebellions, an event that would serve as the bloody and tragic final act in the long and complex drama of the Meiji Restoration, was the Great Satsuma Rebellion of the year 1877. The rebellion was led by a man who was, in a profound and deeply ironic sense, one of the central and most heroic figures of the Restoration itself, a powerful and deeply respected samurai from the domain of Satsuma who had been one of the key military and political leaders in the war to overthrow the shogunate, but who had subsequently become deeply and profoundly disillusioned with the radical and, in his view, culturally destructive path that the new Meiji government had chosen to take. Having resigned from his high position in the central government and returned to his home domain in Kagoshima, he had become the charismatic and almost messianic leader of a vast and growing army of disaffected and impoverished former samurai, who saw in him the last, best hope for a restoration of their lost world and the preservation of the traditional samurai spirit. The rebellion, which began with the seizure of the government armory in Kagoshima, quickly escalated into a full-scale and exceptionally bloody civil war, as the rebel army, which at its height numbered some 40,000 men, began a long and ultimately futile northward march to confront the armies of the central government. The war, which lasted for almost 8 months and which was fought with an almost unparalleled ferocity and a tragic and deeply personal intensity, as the men on both sides were overwhelmingly of samurai origin, was a brutal and one-sided demonstration of the profound and irreversible nature of the military revolution that had taken place in the preceding decade. The rebel army, while composed of some of the bravest and most skilled traditional warriors in the nation, was a profoundly anachronistic force, its primary military asset being the skill of the individual swordsman and its primary tactic being the frontal, banzai-style infantry charge, a tactic that was suicidally ineffective against a modern, well-disciplined army that was equipped with repeating rifles and artillery. The new imperial army that was sent to suppress the rebellion, by contrast, was a completely new and modern military instrument, a conscript army that was composed not of the hereditary warrior class, but of commoners, the sons of farmers, artisans and merchants, who had been drafted into the service of the state and who had been trained and equipped according to the most advanced European military doctrines. This new army was armed with modern, breech-loading rifles, with Gatling guns, and with a powerful and well-commanded artillery corps, and it was supported by a modern and efficient logistical system of railways and steamships that was capable of moving and supplying a vast number of troops over a great distance. The war was, in essence, a direct and brutal confrontation between the old feudal Japan and the new modern Japan, and its outcome was never in any serious doubt. After a series of bloody and one-sided battles, the vastly outnumbered and outgunned rebel army was systematically and inexorably pushed back, its ranks decimated by the superior firepower of the imperial forces. The final and iconic battle of the war took place on a hill overlooking the city of Kagoshima, where the rebel leader, with a last small band of a few hundred of his most loyal followers, made a final, hopeless and suicidal charge against the entrenched positions of the imperial army. He was mortally wounded in the attack, and his death, and the subsequent and almost total annihilation of his remaining followers, brought the Satsuma rebellion, and with it the last organized and violent resistance of the samurai class, to a bloody, tragic and definitive end. The suppression of the rebellion was a powerful and unambiguous statement by the new Meiji government that the age of the samurai was well and truly over, and that the future of Japan would be determined not by the sword and the hereditary privileges of a feudal warrior class, but by the rifle, the railroad, and the relentless and unforgiving logic of the modern, industrial nation-state. The administrative and legal records of the early Meiji period, particularly the official decrees and the policy documents that were issued by the new central government in Tokyo, provide a cold, dispassionate, and deeply revealing account of the systematic and almost clinical process by which the samurai class was legislated out of existence. These documents, which were drafted in a new, more direct, and more impersonal style of bureaucratic language that was itself a deliberate break with the more ornate and elusive literary style of the past, are a testament to the cold and unsentimental pragmatism of the Meiji oligarchs, a group of men who, despite their own samurai origins, were entirely willing to sacrifice their own class and its most cherished traditions on the altar of national strength and modernization. One of the earliest and most fundamental of these reforms was the creation of a new, standardized and nationally uniform system of family registration, a process that was known as the Koseki system. This new system, which was based on European models of census-taking and civil administration, replaced the old, decentralized and often inconsistent system of registration that had been maintained by the individual Buddhist temples and the feudal domains, and it created, for the first time in Japanese history, a direct and unmediated relationship between the individual household and the central state. A key and deeply significant feature of this new system was the formal abolition of the old four-tiered class hierarchy of the Tokugawa period. In the new family registers, the old legally enforced distinctions between samurai, farmer, artisan, and merchant were simply erased, and all subjects of the emperor were, with the exception of the imperial family and a new European-style peerage that was created for the former daimyo and the highest-ranking court nobles, to be designated by the single, uniform, and legally undifferentiated status of commoner or heimin. This was not merely a cosmetic or a symbolic change, but was a radical and profoundly transformative legal act, a deliberate and systematic leveling of the social landscape that was designed to create a more homogeneous, more mobile, and more easily governed citizenry. This legal and administrative dissolution of the samurai as a distinct and privileged social class was accompanied by a series of equally significant and far-reaching reforms in the realm of military organization, a process that struck at the very heart of the samurai's traditional and defining social function as the nation's exclusive and hereditary warrior class. The Meiji government, which had come to power through the force of its own modernized Western-style army, was acutely and uncomfortably aware of the profound and unacceptable anachronism of a military system that was based on the hereditary privileges of a small and exclusive social elite. The great and existentially threatening lesson that the oligarchs had learned from their encounters with the West was that the strength of a modern nation was directly proportional to its ability to mobilize the entire productive and military potential of its population, a principle that was fundamentally incompatible with the old, feudal system in which the duty and the right to bear arms was the exclusive monopoly of a small and often impoverished warrior class. In the year 1873, the government took the single most radical and revolutionary step in its entire program of social and military reform with the promulgation of the Universal Conscription Law, an edict that declared that it was now the universal and non-negotiable obligation of all able-bodied male subjects of the emperor, regardless of their social class or their family background, to serve a fixed term of active and reserve duty in the new, National Imperial Japanese Army. This was an act of profound and almost unimaginable social and cultural revolution, a complete and total repudiation of the most fundamental and deeply held principles of the old samurai-dominated world. The very idea that a commoner, the son of a farmer or a merchant, could be not only permitted but legally compelled to bear arms in the service of the state, and that he could be trained to fight and to die with the same honor and the same sense of duty as a man who was born into the warrior class, was a concept that was so profoundly and fundamentally alien to the entire 700-year-old tradition of samurai rule as to be almost incomprehensible, and it was, for many of the more conservative and traditionalist members of the samurai class, the ultimate and most unforgivable of all the Meiji government's many betrayals. The creation of this new conscript army, an institution that was based not on the hereditary principle of blood and birth, but on the modern and impersonal principles of universal citizenship and national obligation, was the final and definitive act that rendered the samurai as a class, not only economically and socially, but also militarily, obsolete. The personal and often deeply poignant accounts of the samurai who lived through this period of profound and disorienting transformation, which survive in the form of diaries, memoirs, and letters, provide a more intimate and human-scale perspective on the immense and often painful social and psychological adjustments that were demanded by the new age. These were men who had been born and raised in a world that was defined by a clear, stable, and seemingly immutable set of rules and expectations, a world in which their social identity, their economic security, and their entire sense of personal worth were all derived from their hereditary status as members of the ruling warrior class. The sudden and almost total collapse of this world, and the imposition of a new and entirely alien set of values and social norms, created a profound and widespread crisis of meaning, a deep and often agonizing struggle to find a new and viable place for themselves in a society that no longer seemed to have any need for their traditional skills or any respect for their most deeply cherished ideals. One of the most common and recurring themes in these personal accounts is a profound and almost debilitating sense of nostalgia for the lost world of the past, a past that was, in the soft and forgiving light of memory, often romanticized and idealized into a golden age of honor, of loyalty, and of a simple and unambiguous moral clarity. The writers of these memoirs often lament the passing of the old, unwritten codes of conduct and the complex and graceful web of personal and feudal obligations that had once governed all social interactions, and they express a deep and visceral contempt for the new modern world that was replacing it, a world that they saw as being crass, materialistic, individualistic, and deeply and profoundly ugly. The new Western-style clothing that was now becoming increasingly fashionable, the new clattering and smoke-belching machines of the factories and the railways, and the new, more direct and less deferential manners of the newly empowered commoner class were all, in their eyes, symbols of a deep and catastrophic cultural decline, a tragic and unnecessary abandonment of the unique and superior spiritual and aesthetic traditions of the Japanese nation. This profound sense of cultural and personal loss was often accompanied by an equally profound and more immediate and practical sense of economic anxiety and personal humiliation. The memoirs are filled with detailed and often painful accounts of the desperate and often unsuccessful attempts by these former warriors to make a living in the new, competitive economy, of the failed business ventures, of the slow and inexorable slide into poverty and debt, and of the deep and abiding shame that was associated with the necessity of engaging in the kind of manual labor or petty commerce that would have been, in the old world, an unthinkable and deeply dishonorable activity for a man of their station. This economic struggle was not merely a matter of material hardship, but was a deep and constant assault on their most fundamental sense of self-worth. For a man who had been raised to believe that his sole and entire purpose in life was to master the art of the sword and to be ready to die at a moment's notice for his lord, the new and mundane reality of having to haggle over the price of a bushel of rice or to bow and scrape before a wealthy and arrogant merchant was a source of almost unbearable psychological torment. This profound and deeply personal crisis of identity and of purpose was a near-universal experience for the members of the dispossessed samurai class, a silent and largely unrecorded tragedy that was played out in the lives of hundreds of thousands of individuals who had been rendered, by the relentless and unforgiving logic of historical change, into a class of anachronisms, a generation of men who were trapped, with their long swords and their ancient codes of honor, between the dead world of the feudal past and a new modern world in which they no longer had any meaningful or honorable place. The new Western-style, conscript-based Imperial Japanese army that had been created by the Meiji government in the year 1873, and which had so decisively and brutally proven its effectiveness in the suppression of the Satsuma Rebellion, was not merely a new and more technologically advanced military institution, but was a profoundly transformative and ideologically powerful social engine, a national school of indoctrination that was deliberately and systematically designed to break down the old, localized and feudal loyalties of the past and to replace them with a new uniform and deeply emotional sense of loyalty to the emperor and to the modern, centralized Japanese nation-state. The raw material for this new army was the vast and previously untapped reservoir of the nation's rural peasantry, the millions of young men who were, for the first time in Japanese history, being uprooted from their small, isolated, and intensely traditional village communities and thrust into a completely new and alien world of centralized, bureaucratic, and highly disciplined military life. The experience of the conscript, from the moment he received his summons to the day he was discharged from his term of service, was a carefully choreographed and psychologically overwhelming process of resocialization, a systematic stripping away of his old local identity and the forging of a new national one. Upon arriving at the dreary and unfamiliar barracks of his assigned regiment, the young peasant recruit was subjected to a brutal and dehumanizing process of basic training, a regimen of endless, repetitive drill, of harsh and often arbitrary discipline, and of a constant and unrelenting physical and psychological pressure that was designed to break his individual will and to remold him into a compliant and unquestioningly obedient component of the larger military machine. His traditional, comfortable and locally distinctive clothing was taken from him and replaced with a stiff, unfamiliar and entirely uniform Western-style military uniform. His long hair, which was often worn in a traditional village topknot, was shorn to the scalp, a powerful and deeply symbolic act of separation from his past and his induction into a new and homogeneous corporate body. He was taught to march in step, to respond instantly and without question to the shouted commands of his officers, who were almost exclusively drawn from the old samurai class, and to handle and to maintain his new and unfamiliar weapon, the breech-loading rifle, a piece of modern, precision machinery that was a world away from the simple agricultural implements of his former life. The language of the barracks was a new, standardized, and often artificially formal version of the Japanese language, a deliberate and effective tool for breaking down the strong regional dialects that were a primary marker of local identity, and the daily routine was governed by the new and equally alien and abstract logic of the clock, a relentless and minutely subdivided system of time that was entirely at odds with the slower, more natural and more seasonal rhythms of the agricultural year. The most powerful and effective tool of this process of indoctrination, however, was the new and state-sponsored ideology of emperor worship and of a unique and divinely ordained national destiny. Through a constant and unrelenting program of lectures, of patriotic songs, and of ritualized obeisance to the portrait of the emperor, the conscript was taught to see himself not as a peasant from a particular village or a particular domain, but as a soldier of the emperor, a direct and personal servant of a semi-divine, national father figure, and to believe that the highest and most noble calling in his life was to be ready to die, without question and without hesitation, for the greater glory of the emperor and the Japanese nation. This new, modern, and highly potent form of nationalism, which was systematically and effectively inculcated in the barracks of the new imperial army, would become one of the most powerful and enduring legacies of the Meiji Restoration, a force that would not only succeed in unifying the deeply fragmented and localized world of feudal Japan, but which would also, in the decades to come, provide the ideological and the emotional fuel for the nation's rapid and often aggressive expansion onto the international stage. The profound and far-reaching transformations that were remaking the political, the social, and the military landscape of Meiji Japan were accompanied by an equally dramatic and visually arresting transformation of the nation's built environment and its material culture, a process of rapid and often jarring westernization that was a direct and visible expression of the government's central and all-consuming ideological commitment to the national slogan of Bunmei Kaika, or civilization and enlightenment. The old, familiar and gracefully understated architectural and aesthetic landscape of the Tokugawa period, a world of wood, of paper, and of thatch, began to be systematically and often brutally overlaid with a new and entirely alien set of architectural forms and material technologies that were the direct and deliberate importations of the industrial West. The skyline of the nation's capital, which had for centuries been dominated by the low, sweeping, and elegant rooflines of the great Buddhist temples and the somber, gray-tiled roofs of the daimyo mansions, began to be punctuated by the strange and unfamiliar silhouettes of a new and aggressively modern type of building. The new ministries of the central government, the new national banks, and the new corporate headquarters were housed in large, imposing, and almost comically grandiose structures of red brick and stone, buildings that were designed by foreign architects, or by their newly trained Japanese disciples, in the heavy, ornate and self-consciously Western styles of the Victorian era, with their neoclassical columns, their Palladian porticos and their French-inspired mansard roofs. These new buildings, which were constructed with new and unfamiliar materials and which were filled with new and unfamiliar technologies, such as glass windows, gas lighting and Western-style furniture, were not merely functional administrative centers, but were powerful and didactic ideological statements, tangible and unavoidable symbols of the new Meiji state's irreversible commitment to the path of modernity and its determination to create a capital city that could stand as a proud and equal peer to the great capitals of London, of Paris, and of Berlin. This process of architectural and urban transformation was accompanied by an equally dramatic and often more personal and immediate transformation in the realm of clothing and personal appearance, as the new Meiji elite, and the growing urban middle class that sought to emulate them, began a slow and often awkward process of abandoning the traditional and elegant garments of the past in favor of the more civilized and enlightened, though often far less comfortable and less climatically appropriate fashions of the West. The old, flowing and intricately layered robes of the samurai and the court nobility were gradually replaced, at least for the purposes of public and official life, by the stiff, restrictive and somber uniform of the 19th century European gentleman. The woolen frock coat, the starched white shirt, the cravat, and the leather boot. The most potent and the most symbolically charged of all these sartorial innovations was the Western-style military uniform, which was adopted not only by the new national army and the police, but also by a vast and ever-growing army of civil servants, of railway conductors, of postal workers, and even of schoolboys, a visual and deeply powerful symbol of the new, modern, and highly regimented social order that was being imposed upon the nation. The most radical and the most visible of all these changes in personal appearance was the new and officially sanctioned fashion for short, Western-style haircuts for men. In the year 1871, the emperor himself, in a powerful and highly publicized symbolic gesture, cut off his traditional samurai-style topknot, or chanmij, and adopted a Western hairstyle, an act that was immediately and universally interpreted as an imperial command for all of the men of the nation to do likewise. The subsequent and almost overnight disappearance of the topknot, which had for centuries been the single most distinctive and the most universally recognized visual marker of the Japanese male, was a powerful and deeply unsettling symbol of the speed and the totality of the cultural revolution that was sweeping across the land, a visible and daily reminder to the dispossessed and increasingly anachronistic samurai that the old familiar world that they had known and that their ancestors had inhabited for centuries was now, quite literally, vanishing before their very eyes. The rapid and often disorienting process of state-sponsored westernization, while profoundly and irreversibly transforming the political, the economic and the material landscape of the Meiji nation, did not result in a simple or a total abandonment of the traditional Japanese cultural and intellectual traditions, but instead initiated a long, complex, and often deeply anxious and contradictory process of cultural negotiation and intellectual synthesis. The leading thinkers and the policymakers of the Meiji period, the men who were the primary architects of the new Japan, were not, for the most part, uncritical and slavish imitators of the West, but were engaged in a difficult and self-conscious intellectual struggle to find a viable and sustainable balance between the two seemingly irreconcilable worlds of the East and the West. A struggle that was encapsulated in the popular and deeply influential slogan of the age, Wakan Yosai, which can be translated as Japanese spirit, Western technology. This slogan, which was first articulated by the great and influential reformist scholar, a man of samurai origins who had been one of the earliest and most passionate advocates for the study of the West, was not merely a catchy and convenient turn of phrase, but was the clear and concise expression of a deeply held and widely shared intellectual and cultural strategy. A programmatic and highly selective approach to the process of modernization that sought to adopt and to master the practical, the scientific and the technological tools of the West, while at the same time preserving and even strengthening what was believed to be the unique, superior and immutable spiritual and ethical core of the Japanese national identity. The Western technology, half of this equation, was a relatively straightforward, though immensely difficult and expensive, undertaking. It was a matter of importing, of studying, and of replicating the tangible and the material hardware of the industrial and the military revolutions. The steam engines, the telegraphs, the railways, the factories, and the modern breech-loading rifles and the ironclad warships. The Japanese spirit, half of the equation, however, was a far more complex, more ambiguous, and more deeply contested concept. The Meiji oligarchs and the new state-sponsored intellectual elite embarked on a deliberate and highly self-conscious project of defining, of codifying, and in many cases, of inventing, a new and officially sanctioned version of the national spirit. A modern and politically useful ideology that was constructed by a process of selectively reinterpreting and repackaging the traditional values and the institutions of the past. The central and most important component of this new state-sponsored ideology was the elevation of the emperor to a position of unprecedented and almost unimaginable sacred and political authority. The emperor, who in the Tokugawa period had been a remote, politically irrelevant, and almost entirely ceremonial figure, was now deliberately and systematically transformed into the living and breathing embodiment of the nation itself, a semi-divine, patriarchal, and infallible figure who was to be the object of the direct, personal, and unconditional loyalty of all of his subjects. The ancient and largely mythical traditions of the Shinto religion, which had for centuries been a diffuse and localized system of nature worship and folk belief, were now systematically reorganized, codified, and transformed into a new and highly politicized state Shinto, a nationalistic and emperor-centered cult that was designed to provide a divine and uniquely Japanese spiritual and ideological foundation for the new modern state. The old, feudal, and samurai-centric ethical code of Bushido, the way of the warrior, was also appropriated, reinterpreted, and universalized, its central and demanding values of loyalty, of self-sacrifice, and of a stoic indifference to death being stripped of their old, feudal context and repurposed as the essential and defining ethical characteristics of the entire Japanese nation, a new, national code of conduct that was now to be expected not only of the old samurai class, but of every farmer, every factory worker, and every common conscript soldier in the new imperial army. This complex and often highly artificial process of ideological construction was a deliberate and largely successful attempt to create a powerful and emotionally resonant sense of national unity and of a unique and superior cultural identity, a spiritual and ethical bulwark that was intended to protect the nation from the perceived dangers of the decadent, the materialistic, and the excessively individualistic culture of the West. The lived and often deeply painful reality for the vast and dispossessed majority of the former samurai class was one of profound and almost total exclusion from this new and carefully constructed national narrative. While the elite and well-connected members of their class were busily and successfully reinventing themselves as the new modern leaders of the Meiji state, and while the commoners were being mobilized and indoctrinated into a new and empowering sense of national and patriotic identity through the new universal institutions of the conscript army and the compulsory school system, the great, silent, and impoverished majority of the Shizoku, the new and blandly administrative term that was used to designate the former samurai, found themselves trapped in a kind of social and ideological limbo, a world in which they were neither the masters of the old society nor the fully integrated and valued members of the new one. The new Meiji state, which had been built by men of their own class and which was now being led by their former peers, had, in a very real and tangible sense, no further use for them. Their traditional and highly specialized military skills were now obsolete, their old, feudal and localized loyalties were now a political anachronism, and their hereditary and economically unproductive status was now an intolerable and unsustainable burden on the new modernizing state. The government's solution to this samurai problem was not one of social welfare or of compassionate reintegration, but was a policy of a kind of managed and deliberate neglect, a slow and inexorable process of economic and social attrition that was designed to force the former samurai to shed their old, privileged identity and to dissolve, as individuals and as families, into the great, undifferentiated mass of the common people. The one-time lump sum payment of the government bonds that had been given to the samurai in commutation of their hereditary stipends was, for the vast majority of the recipients, a wholly inadequate and often rapidly squandered financial settlement. Lacking any experience in the world of finance and investment, and often possessing a deeply ingrained and culturally conditioned contempt for the very idea of commerce, many of the former samurai quickly lost their entire financial settlement in a series of ill-advised and often fraudulent business schemes, and they were plunged into a state of almost total and abject poverty. The personal accounts and the literary fiction of the period are filled with the tragic and often deeply pathetic stories of these fallen warriors, of men who were forced to sell off their ancestral swords and their family heirlooms, piece by piece, simply to feed their families, of men who were reduced to pulling rickshaws, to making umbrellas, or to performing other equally menial and, in their eyes, deeply dishonorable forms of manual labor. This profound and deeply personal experience of economic and social degradation, this fall from the very pinnacle of the social order to its lowest and most despised rungs, was a source of an immense and often deeply internalized sense of shame, of failure, and of a profound and almost existential sense of personal worthlessness. The samurai, the men who had for centuries been the very embodiment of the nation's honor and its martial spirit, were now, in the new and unforgiving world of Meiji Japan, little more than a class of impoverished and socially marginal anachronisms, the first and the most tragic of all the victims of the very modernizing revolution that their own class had, in a final and deeply ironic act of self-destruction, helped to bring into being. The final and definitive suppression of the Satsuma Rebellion in the year 1877, while a catastrophic and existentially devastating event for the dispossessed samurai who had participated in it, was, for the new Meiji government, a profoundly clarifying and deeply consolidating moment, a bloody and tragic but ultimately necessary rite of passage that served to confirm, in the most brutal and unambiguous way possible, the irreversible nature of the new political and military order. The swift and overwhelming victory of the new national and conscript-based imperial army over the forces of the old, feudal, and samurai-centric tradition was a powerful and deeply resonant demonstration of the absolute and unchallengeable military supremacy of the modern, centralized state, a lesson that was not lost on the other potential centers of reactionary and anti-government sentiment that still lingered in the more remote and conservative corners of the Japanese archipelago. The rebellion was, in essence, the last, convulsive and ultimately futile armed protest of the old Japan against the new, and its decisive and bloody failure effectively extinguished the last, lingering possibility that the course of the Meiji Restoration could be reversed or even significantly altered by the force of traditional military opposition. With the samurai threat now permanently and definitively neutralized, the Meiji oligarchs were free to proceed with the next and even more ambitious phase of their program of state-directed modernization, a process that would now be unencumbered by the constant and distracting threat of internal reactionary violence and which would be focused on the creation of a modern, constitutional, and internationally recognized political system that could stand as a proud and equal peer to the great, liberal nation-states of the West. The decade and a half that followed the suppression of the Satsuma Rebellion was a period of intense and often contentious political and intellectual debate, a time in which the central question that confronted the nation was no longer whether Japan should modernize, but how and in what specific political form that modernization should proceed. The primary and most significant challenge to the absolute and unaccountable power of the ruling oligarchy during this period came not from the now defunct and politically irrelevant class of the former samurai, but from a new and increasingly vocal and well-organized political movement known as the Freedom and People's Rights Movement, or Jiu-Minken-Undu. This movement, which was led by a new generation of Western-educated intellectuals and a number of prominent and politically ambitious former samurai who had been excluded from the inner circle of the ruling oligarchy, was a direct and self-conscious importation of the liberal and the democratic political ideologies of the West, and its central and defining demand was for the creation of a written constitution and the establishment of a popularly elected National Assembly, or Parliament, which would give the people a direct and meaningful voice in the governance of their own nation. The leaders of this movement, while often deeply critical of the autocratic and heavy-handed methods of the ruling oligarchs, were not, for the most part, anti-government revolutionaries in the Western sense, but were loyal and patriotic subjects of the emperor who argued that the creation of a more open, more participatory, and more constitutionally limited form of government was not a threat to the stability of the new Meiji state, but was in fact the essential and non-negotiable prerequisite for its long-term strength and its international respectability. They argued, with a considerable and often persuasive force, that the true and ultimate source of the power of the great Western nations, such as Great Britain and the United States, was to be found not only in their industrial and their military might, but also in the dynamic and creative energies of their free, educated, and politically empowered citizenry, a source of national strength that the autocratic and repressive policies of the current government were in danger of stifling. The response of the Meiji oligarchs to this new and more intellectually sophisticated form of political opposition was a complex and often contradictory mixture of cautious and incremental concession and of a severe and often brutal political repression. A dual strategy that was designed to manage and to co-opt the growing popular demand for political participation while at the same time ensuring that the ultimate and effective control of the state remained firmly and exclusively in their own hands. The long and often acrimonious political struggle between the ruling oligarchy and the popular rights movement finally culminated, in the year 1889, with the promulgation of the Constitution of the Empire of Japan, a document that was a masterpiece of political and legal ambiguity, a carefully crafted and deeply conservative compromise that was designed to create the outward and institutional forms of a modern Western-style constitutional monarchy, while at the same time preserving the essential and untrammeled reality of a transcendent and almost absolute imperial authority. The Constitution, which was largely the work of a single, powerful, and deeply conservative oligarch who had traveled extensively in Europe and who was a particular admirer of the authoritarian and militaristic political model of Bismarck's Prussia, was not the product of a popular and democratic constitutional convention, but was drafted in secret by a small and select committee of the ruling elite and was then presented to the nation as a benevolent and magnanimous gift from the emperor to his loyal and grateful subjects. The document did, in fact, create a new bicameral and partially elected National Assembly, the Imperial Diet, which was given the power to debate and to approve the annual budget and to pass legislation, a significant and genuinely liberal concession to the demands of the popular rights movement. The powers of this new elected body, however, were severely and deliberately circumscribed by a series of powerful and overlapping constitutional checks and balances that were designed to ensure that the ultimate and effective power remained firmly in the hands of the emperor and his unelected, oligarchic advisors. The cabinet and the prime minister who led it were not responsible to the elected lower house of the Diet, but were appointed by and were responsible only to the emperor, and the military, the army and the navy, was placed under the direct and personal command of the emperor, a constitutional provision that effectively removed it from any form of civilian or parliamentary control. The most significant and the most fateful of all the Constitution's provisions, however, was the one that defined the status and the power of the emperor himself. The emperor, in the carefully chosen and deeply ambiguous language of the text, was declared to be sacred and inviolable, a semi-divine and transcendent figure who was the sole and ultimate source of all sovereignty in the state and who stood, in a legal and a constitutional sense, entirely above and beyond the law and the political process. This constitutional enshrinement of the emperor as a kind of super-political national deity was a deliberate and brilliant act of ideological engineering, a move that was designed to provide the new, modern, and in many ways deeply alien and unsettling political order with a powerful and emotionally resonant source of traditional and uniquely Japanese legitimacy. The emperor, in this new and carefully constructed system, was to serve as the silent, sacred, and unchanging core of the nation's identity, a divine and paternalistic symbol of national unity who would be the object of the unconditional and quasi-religious devotion of all of his subjects, while the messy and contentious business of actual day-to-day politics was to be carried out, in his name and under the cover of his sacred authority, by the small and unelected group of practical and hard-headed men who were the true and effective rulers of the Meiji state. This complex and deeply contradictory political system, which sought to graft the institutional and the technological forms of the modern Western nation-state onto a deeply traditional and uniquely Japanese foundation of a divine and absolute imperial authority, was the final and the most enduring of all the political creations of the Meiji Restoration, a powerful and highly effective, though ultimately deeply problematic and dangerously unstable, solution to the profound and existential crisis that had been initiated by the arrival of the black ships some 4 decades earlier. The successful promulgation of the Meiji Constitution in the year 1889, and the subsequent convening of the first, elected imperial deity in the following year, marked, in a formal and a symbolic sense, the completion of the primary, nation-building phase of the Meiji Restoration. In the space of a single, tumultuous, and almost unimaginably compressed generation, the small and far-sighted group of oligarchs who had seized power in the name of the emperor had succeeded, beyond even their own most ambitious and optimistic expectations, in transforming the weak, fragmented, and technologically backward feudal archipelago of the mid-19th century into a strong, unified, and rapidly modernizing nation-state, a new and formidable power that was now, for the first time, capable of demanding and of receiving a measure of respect and recognition on the international stage. Having now secured the nation's internal political and social order, and having laid the essential institutional and industrial foundations for a modern, national economy and a modern, national military, the leaders of Meiji Japan now turned their attention outward, to the final and most critical and demanding of all their long-term strategic objectives. The revision of the unequal treaties that had been imposed upon the nation by the Western powers in the chaotic and humiliating decade of the 1850s and 60s. These treaties, which had been signed under the direct and undeniable threat of foreign military force, were a constant and deeply galling source of national humiliation, a powerful and ever-present reminder of the nation's past weakness and its still subordinate status in the unforgiving and unapologetically hierarchical world of 19th-century international relations. The most offensive and practically damaging of the provisions of these treaties were the clauses that granted the right of extraterritoriality to foreign nationals, a legal principle that effectively removed all Western citizens on Japanese soil from the jurisdiction of the Japanese legal system, and the clauses that denied Japan the right of tariff autonomy, a provision that fixed the nation's import and export duties at a very low flat rate and which effectively prevented the Japanese government from using protective tariffs to nurture its own new and still fragile infant industries. The revision of these unequal treaties and the achievement of full legal and economic sovereignty was therefore not merely a matter of national pride, but was a critical and non-negotiable prerequisite for the nation's long-term economic development and its achievement of a genuine and meaningful political independence. The long and often frustrating diplomatic struggle to achieve this goal would become the central and all-consuming preoccupation of Japanese foreign policy for the final decade of the 19th century. The Western powers, while willing to acknowledge and even to admire the remarkable speed and the thoroughness of Japan's modernization, were deeply reluctant to relinquish the significant legal and commercial advantages that the old treaties afforded them, and the Japanese diplomats were repeatedly and condescendingly informed that a revision of the treaties would only be possible once Japan had demonstrated, to the complete and unilateral satisfaction of the West, that it had fully and successfully transformed itself into a civilized nation, a nation whose legal and political institutions were fully in accord with the standards of the Christian and the European world. This condescending and deeply hypocritical attitude on the part of the Western powers served only to strengthen the resolve of the Meiji leaders and to convince them that the only language that the West truly understood and respected was the language of military power. In a cold and brutally pragmatic calculation, the oligarchs concluded that the swiftest and most effective way to demonstrate Japan's newfound civilized status, and to force the Western powers to finally treat it as an equal, was to successfully and decisively wage and win a modern Western-style war against a recognizable and internationally significant opponent. The chosen and almost inevitable target for this demonstration was the ancient, vast and now profoundly and visibly moribund Chinese Empire, a nation that had for centuries been the great and undisputed cultural and political center of the East Asian world, but which was now, in the late 19th century, in a state of almost total and catastrophic internal decay, its own belated and half-hearted attempts at modernization having proven to be a dismal and almost total failure. The subsequent and brilliantly executed Sino-Japanese War of 1894 to 1895 was a stunning and almost unbelievably one-sided affair, a brief and brutal conflict in which the new, modern, and highly disciplined Imperial Japanese Army and Navy, which were equipped with the latest, Western-made weaponry and which were commanded by a new generation of professionally trained and highly competent officers, swiftly and decisively annihilated the vastly larger but hopelessly antiquated, poorly led, and deeply corrupt military forces of the Qing dynasty. The war was, in essence, a direct and almost clinical test of the two competing models of East Asian modernization, and its outcome was a powerful and unambiguous vindication of the thoroughgoing and revolutionary approach of the Meiji reformers. The swift and total victory, which was a profound and deeply shocking event for the Western powers, who had almost universally underestimated the new military capabilities of Japan, had its desired diplomatic effect, and in the years immediately following the war, the Western nations, led by Great Britain, finally agreed to the revision of the unequal treaties and to the formal and definitive abolition of the hated principle of extraterritoriality, A diplomatic triumph that was the final and the crowning achievement of the entire long and arduous process of the Meiji Restoration. The profound and almost unimaginable transformations that had been wrought by the Meiji Restoration, a process that had, in the space of a single human lifetime, propelled the nation from a state of self-imposed feudal isolation into the front ranks of the modern industrial and imperialist world powers, had come at a significant and often deeply painful human and cultural cost. The final and most poignant of all the victims of this relentless and unforgiving process of state-directed modernization was the class that had, in a final and deeply ironic act of collective self-immolation, been the primary and most essential agent of the restoration itself: the samurai. The new, modern, and increasingly powerful and self-confident Japan that had emerged at the dawn of the 20th century was a world that had been built upon the ruins of their old, feudal society, a world that was governed by a new set of political and economic principles that were almost entirely alien to their own traditional and deeply cherished worldview. The old, samurai-centric values of hereditary status, of martial honor, and of a profound and almost aesthetic disdain for the vulgar and materialistic concerns of the marketplace had been almost entirely swept away and replaced by the new and more pragmatic and prosaic values of the modern, capitalist and bureaucratic state. The values of meritocracy, of technical competence, of economic efficiency, and of a disciplined and unquestioning loyalty to the new, impersonal, and all-powerful institutions of the nation. For the small and highly successful minority of the former samurai who had managed to navigate the difficult and treacherous transition and to reinvent themselves as the new modernizing elite of the Meiji state, the restoration was a story of a triumphant and patriotic success. For the vast and forgotten majority of their less fortunate and less adaptable brethren, however, the story was a far more tragic and a far more personal one, a story of a slow and inexorable slide into poverty, into social marginality, and into a profound and almost existential sense of irrelevance. The samurai, the men who had for centuries been the undisputed political, the social, and the cultural masters of the Japanese nation, were now little more than a ghostly and anachronistic presence in a new and unfamiliar world that they themselves had, in a final and tragic paradox, done so much to create. The day that the samurai realized their world was ending was not a single dramatic and easily identifiable moment, but was a long, slow, and agonizingly protracted process of dawning and unwelcome recognition, a gradual and deeply painful awakening to the stark and unavoidable reality that the relentless and forward-moving tide of history had simply, and without ceremony, passed them by. As the weight of sleep slowly closes your eyelids, let your imagination wander through the ages in your dreams. If you enjoyed the video, I invite you to like it. There are more boring history stories to help you fall asleep. See you at bedtime. Goodbye.